I never imagined that a single call could alter everything I believed in. I'd spent years building a stable life, working late nights, pouring all my energy into a job I loved and a marriage I thought was unbreakable. I was the reliable one, the guy who kept his head down, who'd chosen stability over ambition in most things. My wife, Emily, and I had built a life around that. Plans for a family, vacations we never seemed to find the time for, late nights where she'd wait up for me with a glass of wine. But all of that cracked open in a single evening. That call came out of nowhere. It was from a colleague, a guy named Ray, someone I didn't know well outside of work. Yet, here he was, intruding into the part of my life I'd thought was separate from the office. Ray's message was unsettling. He'd seen Emily out on the town, not just running errands or meeting up with friends, but with another man. I could sense his discomfort as he hesitated over the details. Ray's not the type to meddle, so if he decided to reach out, he must have felt he needed to tell me. The weight of his words settled over me slowly. I didn't know what to do with it at first. I'd always thought I'd know if something like this was happening, but as I sat there alone in the quiet of my study, each passing second brought back small, forgotten details that suddenly seemed glaring. I remembered the times Emily brushed off my questions when her phone buzzed late at night, saying it was just a friend or something to do with her volunteer work. I'd never pressed further. She'd recently bought some new clothes, ones she didn't wear around me. When I'd noticed and complimented her, she'd laughed it off, saying they were just for self-care. At the time, I'd believed her. But now, replaying those conversations in my mind, I started seeing them differently. I couldn't shake the images Ray had painted. Emily, dressed up, laughing with someone else, in places she and I had frequented together. It didn't fit the person I thought I knew. Yet, I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling that maybe I'd been living in some self-imposed blindness, trusting her without question because I wanted to believe in what we had. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every shadow stretching out into something darker, more ominous. The weight of doubt hung over me, gnawing away at memories I'd always held dear. I couldn't stop myself from picking through them, examining every look Emily had given me in the past few months, every small excuse that had seemed so innocent at the time. It felt like I was spiraling down a tunnel, searching for some clue I'd missed, something that might have told me this was coming. But the worst part was that I had no answers, just questions, each one heavier than the last. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed proof, something more than a vague, unsettling suspicion. The next day, I went to work like normal, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. I could barely focus on anything, just going through the motions, nodding along in meetings, but every thought, every shred of energy, was spent trying to figure out my next move. The logical part of me, the engineer in me, was fighting to take over, to find a solution or a path forward. But every time I tried to think clearly, a wave of anger, disbelief, or just plain sadness would hit me, leaving me stuck, like I was trying to solve a problem I couldn't understand. Emily and I met during college, back when I was just starting out as a mechanical engineering major, and she was studying psychology. I was the quiet type, more comfortable with numbers than with people, but Emily was different. She had this warmth, a presence that put everyone around her at ease. She brought light into my life in ways I never expected. I was certain she was the one from the start, and I poured my everything into building a future with her. But now, that future seemed to be slipping through my hands like sand. I tried to recall every interaction we'd had over the last few weeks, hunting for signs I might have missed. It hit me how much she'd changed in little ways. Emily used to be home every evening, waiting up for me when I got back from the office. Lately, though, her schedule had shifted. She'd say she was grabbing dinner with friends or heading to some networking event. I'd never questioned it because I'd wanted her to have her own life, her own space. I thought that was what a strong marriage was built on, trust. Now that trust felt foolish. I couldn't stand feeling like some clueless guy in his own life, walking around while everyone else knew a secret he didn't. I knew I had to do something to find the truth for myself. I couldn't confront her based on hearsay. I needed concrete proof. That evening, I made up my mind to look through her things. It felt invasive, like I was betraying the very foundation of our marriage. But I reasoned that if there was really nothing to find, it would put my mind at ease, and if there was something, well, it was better to know. I waited until she'd gone out again that night, claiming she was meeting friends. I remember the weight of guilt in my chest as I opened her laptop, feeling almost like an intruder in my own home. But I was desperate, and when desperation takes over, lines blur. I checked her messages, her emails, scrolling past the familiar names of her friends and family. Nothing seemed out of place, and for a minute, I felt almost foolish for letting paranoia get the best of me. But then, I stumbled upon a name I didn't recognize. A series of emails between Emily and someone named Luke. I felt my stomach drop as I clicked on the first one. As soon as I saw the emails, I knew I was staring at exactly what I dreaded. The messages began casually enough, full of small talk about meetups and catching up, but the deeper I scrolled, the more their tone shifted. There were phrases that lingered in my mind, words that seemed carefully chosen, loaded with meaning beyond what a simple friendship should hold. Luke appeared to be someone Emily knew from her time volunteering. She'd mentioned him once or twice, casually, even with a smile, saying she'd run into him at the shelter. I'd barely registered it, maybe even felt glad she had friends who shared her interests. It never occurred to me that her life outside of ours could turn into something more. As I read on, one email stood out. It was dated the night before our anniversary, and she'd written to him about it. Emily mentioned she'd be busy celebrating with me but wished she could spend the evening with someone who understood her. I felt my chest tighten as the words settled in. She'd felt misunderstood, disconnected from me. This was the woman I'd spent a decade with, the woman I'd thought knew me as deeply as I knew her. Yet, here she was, confiding in someone else, sharing thoughts she'd never shared with me. A memory surfaced then, one that felt almost insignificant at the time but now carried a weight I hadn't realized. Our anniversary night had felt a bit off, more subdued than usual. We'd gone to the same Italian place we always went to, sat by the window where we always did. I'd brought her roses, and she'd smiled, but in hindsight, it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that suggested her mind was elsewhere. Now, painfully, I could see exactly where her thoughts had been drifting. I returned to the emails, hoping that somehow this would reveal itself as a misunderstanding. But the further I went, the more undeniable it became. Luke had written to her about looking forward to seeing her again, about how beautiful she'd looked the last time they met. His words were careful but intimate. It was as if he knew they had to keep things subtle but still wanted to remind her of their connection. I lost track of time as I pored over those conversations, every word peeling back another layer of my disbelief. It felt as though I was looking in on someone else's life, watching a version of Emily I'd never met before. At some point, I realized my hands had been gripping the edge of her laptop so tightly that my knuckles were turning white. I closed the laptop and sat back, staring into the dimness of the room, feeling both hollow and heavy. The person I'd trusted more than anyone else in the world had hidden an entire part of her life from me. It wasn't just the act of betrayal, it was that she'd chosen someone else, let someone else in so deeply, in a way I thought was reserved for us alone. In that moment, it was like grief and anger merged into one. Grief for the life I thought we had, and anger that she'd taken that from me, had made me question myself, my role, and my worth in our marriage.
I spent the next few days in a daze, functioning on autopilot. The world around me seemed muted, drained of color and energy. Work provided an escape, a way to shut out the noise in my head, but even that was a struggle. I'd catch myself staring blankly at my computer screen, lost in thought, only to snap back and realize half an hour had slipped by. Every moment at home felt heavier than the last, and the distance between Emily and me was growing, no longer just a feeling but a tangible gap I couldn't ignore. She was still herself on the surface, greeting me with a quick peck on the cheek or asking about my day, but I could see through it now. I knew her warmth wasn't mine alone anymore. I was watching her closely now, catching small things I dismissed before. There was a new necklace she'd started wearing, delicate and understated, one I'd never seen her buy. There were the long glances she'd give her phone, eyes flickering down at the screen as if it held some secret promise. Once, I watched her smiling at something on her phone, a soft smile she used to save for me. And each time, I felt that familiar knot tightening in my chest, knowing the warmth she was giving so freely was no longer mine to receive. I was torn between confronting her right away and keeping the secret, letting it simmer while I gathered the strength to face her. I kept running through possible scenarios in my mind, wondering what I'd say, what she might say, and how any of it would even matter. Would she try to deny it? Would she come clean? And did I even want to hear her justifications? Yet, the thought of confrontation felt almost impossible. I wasn't ready to see that side of her, the side that had been hidden from me all this time. I wasn't ready to hear her explain away the betrayal, to hear her tell me that this had somehow been inevitable, or that I was somehow to blame. And the worst part was, part of me knew she'd try. Emily had always been good with words, good at softening any difficult situation, making things feel like they were just small bumps in the road. But this wasn't a bump. This was a canyon, and I wasn't sure it could be bridged. In the quiet hours of the night, I began planning my next move. My logical side took over, urging me to approach this systematically, to gather evidence that would make it impossible for her to talk her way out of it. I remembered an app my colleague had mentioned a few months back, one that could track locations discreetly. My fingers felt almost numb as I installed it on her phone, a final act that felt both wrong and necessary. There was no turning back now. I told myself this was about clarity, about knowing for sure. I needed to see where she went, needed proof beyond emails, beyond the vague suspicion gnawing at my insides. I needed something that would confirm, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the woman I loved was living a life apart from me. When I was finished, I lay awake in the darkness, every nerve on edge, knowing the path I'd just chosen would reveal the truth, one way or another. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I wondered if I was ready for the answers I was about to find.
In the days that followed, the app quietly fed me information I both craved and dreaded. I'd find myself checking it obsessively, my heart pounding as I watched the small icon that marked her location. I'd hoped to catch her slipping, maybe even find a pattern, a specific time or place. Part of me wanted to be proven wrong, to see her heading to places that made sense. Grocery stores, the yoga studio, her friend's house, but I knew better. I knew what I'd find. One night, as I sat alone at the kitchen table with only the dim glow of my phone lighting the room, I saw her location pop up at a small bar across town. It was a place we'd been to once years ago, for a quick drink after work. I hadn't thought of it in years, yet here she was, visiting it as if it held some meaning for her. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling both numb and sick. I wondered who she was there with, if she'd planned it, if she'd lied to cover her tracks. I thought of how casually she'd kissed me on her way out that evening, as if I was just part of her routine, something to pass by on her way to something better. For a few minutes, I wrestled with the urge to drive there, to see it all unfold with my own eyes. I imagined myself sitting in my car outside, watching through the tinted windows as she laughed with him, leaned in close, and wore that soft smile I'd seen on her face just a few nights ago. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The reality of actually seeing them together felt like it would destroy whatever was left of me. I stayed home that night, pacing the house like a stranger in my own life. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. Every object in our house, every framed photo, every piece of furniture, seemed tainted by the secret she carried. I looked at our wedding photo on the mantel, at our smiling faces frozen in time, and felt a surge of bitterness rise in me. That image, the two of us standing hand in hand, looking ahead to a life we thought we'd build together, felt like a cruel joke. Over the next few days, I continued to watch her movements, piecing together a puzzle that was as painful as it was damning. There was another visit to the same bar, then a longer stop at a hotel on the outskirts of town. The pattern was undeniable. Each time she went, she'd come home late, slipping into bed quietly, thinking I was asleep, never suspecting that I knew. I lay there beside her, feeling her presence, hearing her steady breathing, and it felt like I was lying next to a stranger. I wondered how long this had been going on. Had she started seeing him recently, or had it been building for months, maybe years, right under my nose? Every memory I had of us together seemed like it had been tainted. Even the good moments felt false, like they'd only been performances, carefully orchestrated to keep up appearances while she built a life outside our marriage. One night, after she'd come home late again, I couldn't stay silent anymore. She slipped into bed, and I lay there, feeling the cold distance between us. I wanted to ask her, wanted to finally break the silence that was eating me alive. But the words caught in my throat, and I found myself hesitating. I wanted her to be the one to admit it, to come to me and tell me the truth. I wanted her to see what she'd done, to understand the pain she was putting me through, even if she never would. But I knew deep down that it wouldn't happen, that she'd keep lying as long as she could. So I kept quiet, letting the weight of her betrayal settle over me like a shroud. I realized that in the end, the truth had left me feeling hollow. I had my proof, but it brought no relief, no closure. Just an aching emptiness, and the knowledge that the woman I'd loved was no longer the person lying beside me. I don't know how long I could have kept going like that, living with the truth buried inside me. I was moving through my days like a ghost, watching Emily act as though everything was normal, as if we were still the same couple. But with each passing day, my patience frayed, my silence felt unbearable. The weight of knowing, of pretending, gnawed at me every time she looked at me with that easy, unaffected smile. One evening, she came home carrying a small gift bag, acting as though it was just a normal day. She handed it to me with a little grin, telling me she'd been thinking about me, wanted to get me something special. It was a watch, one she must have picked up that day. I remember staring down at it in my hand, feeling the hollowness of the gesture. It was like she was trying to distract me, a peace offering to throw me off her trail. I thanked her, slipping the watch on with a forced smile, but I felt a surge of resentment I could barely contain. It was as if she was buying time, keeping me close enough to maintain appearances but distant enough to live her double life. I watched her fuss over dinner, humming to herself as though she didn't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, my mind was screaming, wanting to confront her, to demand why she'd thought I was the kind of fool who wouldn't notice. That night, after dinner, she settled on the couch with her phone, scrolling through messages with a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. I pretended to be reading, but every few minutes, I'd glance over, feeling a mixture of rage and disbelief. I was watching a stranger in my own living room, a woman who looked like my wife but was someone else entirely. She had this whole life right under my nose, a world she slipped into effortlessly, shutting me out the moment I turned away. It was at that moment I realized that I couldn't hold back much longer. I needed her to understand that I knew, that every secret she'd tried to hide was out in the open, shattering what we'd built together. I imagined what I'd say, every word burning on the tip of my tongue, ready to cut through the silence. I pictured the look on her face when I'd tell her that I knew about Luke, the bars, the hotel, every moment she thought I was oblivious to. But then, just as I was gathering the courage, she looked up from her phone and met my eyes. Her expression softened, and she smiled, reaching out to touch my hand. She spoke about the weekend, asking if we could go to that new brunch place in town, mentioning how nice it would be to spend some time together. The ease of her words, her casual warmth, made me falter. For a split second, I almost believed that maybe she cared, that maybe this was all a mistake and there was still something left between us. But I knew better. I knew that everything she was saying was a part of her act, a way to keep me tethered to her while she continued whatever it was with him. I nodded along, hearing myself agree to brunch, but inside I felt myself retreat, pulling further back from the woman I'd once trusted with everything. This was the Emily she wanted me to see, the loyal, doting wife, the partner who still cared. But I'd seen behind the curtain, and there was no going back. Later that night, lying beside her in bed, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the finality of it all. There was no saving this, no salvaging what we'd once had. It was like a cracked vase. No amount of glue could put it back together and make it whole. I knew, in that quiet, heavy moment, that I'd reached the end of the line. I just needed the right moment to finally confront her, to lay out every piece of the truth I'd gathered. And when I did, there would be no turning back. I waited for the right moment, carrying that burden of truth like a weight pressing down on my chest. Every evening felt like a trial, going through the motions of a marriage that had already shattered in my mind. I could hardly bring myself to look at Emily without feeling that surge of anger and betrayal. I kept my silence, waiting for the perfect moment, though each passing day made the bitterness grow. Then one Saturday morning, I finally saw my chance. She was preparing to go out, carefully choosing her clothes, picking out a perfume she rarely wore, and taking extra time on her makeup. I knew this routine now. It was her preparation for him. Each step was a small betrayal, a ritual that was so clear once I knew what it was. She told me she was heading out to run errands, and wouldn't be gone long. The words stung with their familiarity, the same excuse she'd given every time. I told her I'd be staying home to catch up on work, acting as though everything was perfectly fine. But the moment she walked out that door, I felt a surge of purpose that I hadn't felt in days. Today would be different. I needed to see for myself, to witness the truth beyond just the messages, the locations, and my suspicions. I wanted to be there, to confirm what I already knew deep down. I waited for a few minutes after she left, giving her enough time to be sure she'd reached her destination. Then, I got in my car, heart pounding, a strange calm settling over me as I followed the route I'd seen mapped out on the tracking app. She was at the hotel again, the one on the outskirts of town. I knew the place, a modest spot tucked away just enough to keep things discreet. When I pulled into the lot, I parked at a distance, close enough to see the entrance but far enough to stay hidden. My heart was racing, my mind replaying every moment that had led me here. The hotel was just as nondescript as I remembered, a place people passed by without a second thought. But for me, it had become a symbol of everything that was wrong, everything I was about to confront. I didn't have to wait long. After a few minutes, I saw her emerge from the building, and right beside her was Luke. He wasn't remarkable, just an average-looking guy with an easy confidence that probably made people trust him. They walked close, shoulders nearly touching, talking in low voices as they made their way to his car. She looked up at him, smiling in a way I hadn't seen her smile in months. Her face softened in a way that cut through me like a knife. Seeing them together felt worse than I could have imagined. I'd known this moment would come, had played it out in my head so many times, but nothing prepared me for the finality of it. There they were, like any other couple, slipping into a private world that didn't include me. It was a raw, searing pain, one that came from seeing everything I'd built, everything I believed in, crumbling before my eyes. I stayed there, frozen, watching as they talked in the car, seemingly in no hurry. I could only imagine the easy lies she'd tell me when she came home, the casual excuses she'd give as she looked me in the eye. A part of me wanted to walk over and confront them right there, to let her see me, to make her realize that everything was out in the open. But another part of me knew that I needed a different kind of closure, a way to end this without giving her the chance to turn it around on me, to explain it away or twist the blame. After what felt like an eternity, I watched them drive off. I sat there in the quiet of my car, letting the weight of the betrayal settle over me, letting it become real. I'd seen all I needed. Now, the question was no longer about gathering proof or finding the right words. It was about finding the strength to let go of the life I thought we had, the strength to finally confront her and take the next step forward. I drove home in silence, my mind numb, yet clearer than it had been in weeks. There was no doubt, no room for excuses or explanations. Emily had made her choice. Now it was time for me to make mine. By the time I got home, it felt as if a switch had flipped inside me. I wasn't confused or angry in the same way I had been before. I'd seen the truth, faced it, and now I knew exactly what I had to do. I would confront her. I would tell her that I knew everything, about the hotel, the lies, and the secrets she'd kept hidden. There would be no way for her to talk her way out of this, no place for her to hide. I sat in the quiet of our living room, rehearsing the words in my mind, preparing myself for every excuse she might throw my way. But no amount of preparation could fully brace me for what I was about to do. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I heard her car pull into the driveway. She walked through the door carrying a bag of groceries, her face lighting up with a smile as if nothing had changed. She put on her usual act, humming a little tune as she set the groceries down, glancing over to me and asking how my day had gone. It was as if she believed everything was still the same, as if she hadn't just come back from meeting the man she was hiding from me. I felt a pang of disgust as I watched her, amazed at her ability to compartmentalize, to shift so seamlessly between her two lives. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady but cold. I told her that I knew about Luke, that I'd seen the messages, knew about the bar, the hotel, all of it. For the first time in our marriage, I saw the calm facade drop from her face. Her eyes widened, and her hands went still, hovering over the groceries, frozen mid-motion. She didn't speak, just stared at me, caught off guard, the reality of what I'd said hitting her fully. Without any choice left, she began to stumble over her words, her voice barely above a whisper, trying to explain, to frame it in a way that sounded less damning. She muttered something about needing someone who understood, about feeling neglected, lonely, as if that would somehow make her actions justifiable. Each word out of her mouth felt like salt in a wound. Here she was, attempting to reshape her betrayal into some plea for understanding, trying to position herself as a victim. But I didn't let her finish. I told her that I'd watched her betray me, that I'd seen her with him, and that no amount of explanations would change the fact that she had chosen to betray our marriage, to seek out someone else while pretending that everything was fine. She looked away then, her face draining of color, realizing there was nothing left to say, no way to spin this in her favor. In that moment, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, sorrow, a strange sense of relief. The lies were finally out in the open, exposed, and I felt lighter, freed from the burden I'd been carrying alone. I told her that our marriage was over, that there was no way to rebuild what she'd so carelessly destroyed. She didn't respond, just sat there in stunned silence, her hands trembling slightly as she looked down, unable to meet my gaze. I left her there, standing in the kitchen, surrounded by those groceries that suddenly felt like props in a play that had come to an abrupt end. The truth was out, and there was nothing left for her to hide behind. After that confrontation, the house felt emptier than ever. I thought the hardest part would be getting the truth out in the open, but I quickly realized that what followed was far more difficult. Once everything was said, there was nothing left to hold on to. Emily and I were like strangers now, sharing a house that suddenly felt foreign, each room echoing with memories that felt more like taunts than comforts. We barely spoke, moving around each other in silence, each of us caught in our own thoughts. She stayed in the guest room, and I took our bedroom, but neither of us really slept. Some nights, I'd lie awake, hearing her shift restlessly down the hall, knowing she was just as haunted as I was by the emptiness between us. I wondered if she was thinking of Luke, if she regretted any of it, or if she was just feeling the sting of being exposed. In the daylight, she made some attempts at apologies, reaching out with hesitant words, claiming she hadn't meant for it to go so far. She'd talk about wanting to work through it, and rebuild what we'd lost. But each apology felt hollow, almost rehearsed, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as me. Her remorse was as shallow as her excuses, and I could see she was more shaken by the idea of losing the life we'd built than by the actual pain she'd caused. I couldn't bring myself to respond to her attempts. The thought of forgiveness felt impossible. I had seen her deception too closely, felt the weight of her betrayal too deeply. Every time she looked at me, I saw not the woman I'd married, but the one who had chosen someone else over the life we'd built. There was no repairing that kind of fracture, no way to unsee the reality of who she'd become. In the meantime, I focused on the practicalities, the things that had to be done to untangle our lives. I met with a lawyer, explaining the situation and gathering the information I'd need to end things officially. My lawyer, a calm and efficient woman who'd clearly seen these situations many times, reassured me that the path forward was clear. She advised me to document everything, to keep records of every interaction, every financial detail, everything that could support my case. It felt surreal to be discussing the end of my marriage in such clinical terms, as if I were solving a math problem rather than dismantling a life I'd spent years building. But that detached approach was what kept me grounded, allowed me to move forward without losing myself completely to the pain. As I gathered the documents, changing passwords, and sorting through financial records, I began to see the other side of this, a glimpse of a life beyond this heartbreak. There were moments when I could imagine what it would be like to be free of the weight I'd been carrying, free from the shadows Emily had cast over our marriage. And slowly, as I took each step, I felt something start to shift. I wasn't just dismantling my marriage. I was beginning to rebuild myself. The process was painful, but there was a strange peace in knowing I was taking control, that I was no longer a passive observer in my own life, waiting for someone else to make choices for me. Emily must have sensed it too, because she grew quieter, her attempts to reach out becoming fewer, her expressions more resigned. She knew what was coming, that I was no longer hers to manipulate or convince. I was done, and she could see it as clearly as I felt it. Once the initial shock had worn off, I found myself slipping into a new kind of rhythm, one without Emily at its center. Each day, I'd make small changes, little adjustments that slowly reshaped my life. I rearranged the furniture, cleared out old photos, threw out clothes I didn't wear anymore. I even painted the walls a different color, trying to wash away the memories embedded in them. I wanted a blank canvas, a place that felt like mine again, untainted by betrayal. Emily was still living in the house, though it felt more like a formality. She kept to herself, moving around quietly, careful not to disrupt the silence that now defined our days. She'd spend most of her time in the guest room, as if she could sense how unwelcome her presence had become. Occasionally, I'd hear her on the phone with friends or family, her voice low, as if she didn't want me to overhear. I knew she was trying to hold on to whatever support she could, telling her side of the story, shaping it in a way that would soften the truth. But I didn't care what she told people anymore. There was a strange freedom in letting go of the need to control the narrative. I had the truth, and that was enough. I didn't need anyone else to understand or validate my experience. I was moving forward, and that alone felt like a victory. One evening, after another long day of silence between us, Emily knocked on the doorframe of the living room, hesitating before asking if we could talk. I didn't have the energy to argue, so I nodded, watching as she sat down across from me, a fragile look of guilt etched onto her face. She started talking, her voice softer than usual, her words stumbling over apologies and regrets. She said she never intended for things to end up like this, that she'd felt neglected, lonely, disconnected. She was desperately trying to explain, to find some way to make me understand. But as she spoke, I felt an overwhelming sense of detachment. Her reasons, her feelings, they felt like distant echoes, nothing more than hollow excuses for something I couldn't forgive. Every word she spoke felt like a shallow attempt to reshape the betrayal, to fit it into some framework that made sense to her. Finally, she finished, looking at me with an expectant sadness, as if she was waiting for me to respond, to say something that might absolve her of her guilt. But I had nothing left to give her. All I felt was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, the kind that comes from holding on to too much pain for too long. I told her there was no fixing this, that I'd moved past the point of forgiveness. I could see her eyes fill with a fresh wave of regret, but it was too late. She started to cry then, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back the tears, but I didn't feel sympathy. I watched her, feeling a strange, detached clarity. This was her pain to carry now, the consequence of choices she'd made with open eyes. Eventually she stood up, her gaze dropping to the floor as she whispered that she understood, that she'd start looking for a place to move. I gave a small nod, feeling the weight lift slightly, knowing that soon, this house, my house, would be mine alone. As she left the room, I felt a calm settle over me. The hardest part was over, and now, I could finally begin to rebuild. I wasn't looking back anymore. The path ahead was unknown, but at least it was mine to walk. In the weeks that followed, Emily began packing her things. It was a quiet, almost eerie process, like watching a ghost slowly fade away. She moved through the house without a word, filling boxes with items that had once been part of our life together, things that used to carry meaning but now felt weightless. I avoided the sight as much as I could, choosing instead to focus on work, on keeping myself busy, on reclaiming a sense of normalcy. Each evening, I'd come home to see a few more gaps around the house. First, it was the framed photos she took off the walls, then the little things, her favorite coffee mug, the books she always kept on the nightstand. The bathroom shelves slowly emptied of her perfumes and makeup, her clothes disappeared from the closet, and soon, her presence in the house had dwindled down to a few stray boxes. One night, as I walked into the living room, I noticed she'd left a small envelope on the coffee table. Inside, there was a note in her handwriting. She hadn't spoken to me in days, so this letter was her last effort to reach me, one final attempt to put her thoughts into words. It felt strange to see her handwriting, so familiar yet now laced with a finality that couldn't be undone. In the letter, she explained how sorry she was, how much she regretted what she'd done, and how she wished things had been different. She admitted she hadn't appreciated what we had until it was gone, that she was finally seeing the damage she'd caused. She talked about her own confusion, the way she'd lost sight of herself and the life we'd built. And she said that if she could go back, she'd change it all, undo every lie, every betrayal. I felt a pang of sadness as I read her words, but not the kind that made me question my decision. Her apology, though genuine, came too late. She had made her choices, and I'd come to accept that her actions had led us here. This letter wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was her way of letting go, of acknowledging that we'd reached the end. I folded the letter and set it back on the coffee table. I didn't feel anger or resentment, only a quiet acceptance. She was finally facing the reality of what she'd lost, and I had to admit, there was some comfort in knowing she understood. But the life we'd shared was already behind me, and I knew there was no need to hold on to the echoes of what once was. A few days later, she moved out for good. I was at work when she left, having arranged to stay late to avoid any final awkward goodbyes. When I returned that evening, I walked through the house, feeling the emptiness that had replaced her presence. It was just me now, the rooms quieter, the spaces wider, the silence thicker. As I stood there, alone in the home we'd once built together, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. There was pain, yes, but there was also freedom. The shadows of betrayal had lifted, leaving behind a kind of peace, a calm that came from finally letting go. I was ready to start fresh, to reclaim my life, one day at a time. Emily was gone, but I remained, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. In the days that followed, I adjusted to a life on my own, learning what it meant to reclaim the quiet spaces that had once been filled with memories of us. It felt strange at first, the empty rooms, the solo routines, but soon I began to see it as an opportunity rather than a loss. I started taking the time to rediscover parts of myself that had faded in the background over the years. I picked up old hobbies, things I'd forgotten I loved, reading late into the night, going on long drives with no destination, cooking meals that didn't feel rushed. It wasn't an instant recovery, of course. Some nights, I'd catch myself replaying those old memories, wondering if I could have done something differently, if there were signs I'd missed, moments that could have changed the course of our relationship. But every time those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself that I'd done all I could. I'd been faithful, committed, and I'd given her every chance to be honest. It was Emily who chose another path, and I could no longer carry that weight. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the last of her things she'd left behind in the attic, I found a box I hadn't noticed before. Inside were mementos from our early years together. Old photos, ticket stubs from concerts, even some letters we'd written to each other back when everything felt like it was falling into place. Looking at those pieces of our past, I didn't feel the ache I'd expected. Instead, I felt grateful that I could hold those moments for what they were. Pieces of a chapter that was over but had still meant something. As weeks turned into months, I began to reconnect with friends I hadn't seen in ages, people I'd lost touch with while I was so focused on work and keeping up the illusion of a happy marriage. They welcomed me back without question, ready to listen, to help me move forward without judgment or pity. Slowly, I began to realize that I wasn't defined by this betrayal, that my life didn't have to be shaped by what had happened. One evening, I got a message from an old friend, someone who'd been there during the early days when Emily and I first started dating. She'd heard through mutual friends about the split and reached out to offer her support. We met for coffee, a simple catch-up, but it turned into hours of conversation. I found myself laughing in a way I hadn't in a long time, feeling lighter, freer, like I was finally stepping into a life that was fully my own. Over time, that friendship turned into something more, a quiet companionship built on shared history and the kind of honesty I hadn't known in years. She wasn't there to fix me, and I wasn't looking for someone to replace what I'd lost. Instead, we found comfort in each other's company, a simple, steady warmth that helped me see there was still a future worth building. Looking back now, I see that losing Emily wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a path back to myself. I had let go of the hurt, the betrayal, the need for answers that would never satisfy. And in doing so, I'd made room for something better. The life I was building was different, but it was real, and it was mine. The past was behind me, the scars healing, and with each passing day, I could feel a quiet strength growing within me, a strength I'd never known. I was finally free, standing at the start of something new, ready to embrace whatever came next.